kind of follow along the line of thinking that Fred started is for 40 years. I mean, I've been here over 35 years now, I believe, and 34 years maybe, and David a couple years longer. And the firm has had a certain kind of outlook and ethos based on the three original partners. And because we have established a legacy, we believe that the firm, kind of as an institution, could continue beyond the generation of original partners. And so how, as a group of four, do you work with us to figure out what is the future? How do we blend the individual talents? What is the kind of work we do that might be different? And where the practice of architecture is going, because I feel like it's a moment where it's evolving a little bit. And so how do we curate the talents so that that legacy is adjusted and tweaked, to, God forbid, go another 40 years?
I mean, I think what's been interesting about my position in the design aspect of this practice is that I'm not typically the person that's putting the pen to paper. I'm usually actually putting the word on the paper. And so a lot of my job is thinking about how we express that design ethos. And as Matt mentioned, we don't really have a signature style, but I would say we have a signature ethos. And that has, as difficult as that might actually be to teach to new generations, it's actually a great opportunity to interpret concepts and themes in new and open ways. And so, I was thinking about this as far as, some of the themes that we've talked about in the last, since I've been at the office, that are recurring, that I think are very open-ended, but also really sort of fundamental to our practice. And, I think one of them is practicality. I think this sort of Midwestern leadership has always grounded us in a reality that I think is really powerful. And I think architecture, like a lot of industries, as you were saying, Joe, is evolving, but I think that it needs to be for people, and it needs to be for communities, and it needs to be for the planet. It needs to serve, and it needs to function. And how we take that mandate of practicality and make it beautiful, I think, is a really important lesson for the future. The other thing that I think that maybe Taka and I connect on is this idea that there's this idea of the sensation of experience within space. We take for granted that we spend, 95% of our time indoors. And in our environments, our physical environments really profoundly affect us. And I think that's something that is really interesting to explore from a design perspective and from a psychological perspective. I think we also have this very strong legacy of art integration. Fred is an artist himself, and I think we all really care about the arts. And that's something that's going to be a really interesting way of reinterpreting. I was just having a conversation yesterday about how, for a current client, we can integrate a creative expression of data, which is very, kind of a new and evolving form of artistic expression. And then, I think one of the hallmarks is that, we have our ethos is kind of codified in a little booklet that Fred originally put together and that we've expanded on, called Delight. And I can't imagine anything better than working towards creating spaces and a practice that is grounded in just that notion. Wouldn't it be wonderful if everything we did went back to delight?
Matt, you talk about that, the design and not a signature style. And it's interesting. And Marisa, as you were talking, you reminded me about the ethos and what the design culture came up with. And I actually, at least once a month, which is not a lot, get this out and take a look at what is in there as it relates to a situation of doing something. And I always think how those kind of fundamental principles, which are always there, inform what we do, kind of on a day-to-day basis. And how do those evolve? How do they need to evolve? Taka, you hit on it a little bit, that they've got to change.
It's interesting. I also kind of come back to the book. I mean, that the design culture book that Joe is referring to, that we put together over a year ago now, was trying to formalize a lot of the design concepts, because there's a lot out there. I think it's built up over the years, but never been really formalized and codified so that a wider audience could understand it. And I think we're at the size now that we felt we needed, staff to kind of understand more of those things more quickly as they come on board. And I think it's really helped people have more access to how the partners and designers think in a firm. And I think the way that we build ideas, I often refer to as a layering. And so I think, as Joe, you're asking about kind of moving into the future, how we evolve. And I think it's almost built into the thinking of the firm, where there's almost always room for new ideas, because I think we often layer ideas in projects. It's not necessarily just one driver. It's we're very client focused, so kind of their influence is always taken as the kind of utmost priority. And we work with great teams and take ideas from a lot of different voices. So I think that's a strength, and it will help us kind of keep evolving as the practice changes and grows.
Delight and design culture book are, in a way, very nicely abstract. Especially Delight is very abstract, which gives us a room to think further. That is our opportunity. Whoever in the design team, everybody in the team, get an opportunity to take that and think further, and that is eventually form the shape of architecture. That is kind of, it doesn't have time to it. It's more probably 10 years later, if you take a look at the Delight, you probably think differently. 20 years later, you probably think differently, kind of blending what is happening to the world at that point, and then still Delight is current, and then Delight itself could be added something more to it. That is a kind of great part of Delight, and a supplementary design culture book. Those things that help us keep being creative and adding something to next generation and the future.
Nathan, on the way the practice of architecture is evolving, you had mentioned earlier that so I have some operational responsibility in the practice, and that could be seems like an area of your expertise as well. This idea of how we practice is evolving, partly through technology. It's partly through a more, inclusive world. Is there anything in particular that you see how we need to adapt, or what challenges come out of that?
I do, and actually it combines with the previous question, some of the comments. Just kind of looking at our practice itself, Taka kind of hit on the abstract nature, and I think that's an area where we have been an amazing practice up to this point in terms of just really listening to our clients, understanding them better than they understand themselves. And through that is where we start to find what are the elements that are missing, or what can enrich this experience and process and project. And I think we as a practice, are so good at listening to all our clients that sometimes we aren't good enough in telling our next client how that process works, and being stronger in here's how that does work, here's how we can take all these pieces and, you know, deliver the most amazing project, or the project that meets these specific needs. Because I hate to use this word because it's kind of popular right now, but being a disruptor. I look back at the whole practice, and you really look at Fred's first house, the collage, that was a disruptor day one. So it's kind of these small elements that, you know, we bring to the picture that bring that amazing, like, aha, see that space, these delight moments. I was thinking back to some other projects when we first kind of worked at Princeton, Fred introducing the idea of art into that lobby. And then from that initial idea, Princeton completely shifted their idea of art integration through the rest of their buildings. So it's kind of these small disruptor moments, but how do we clearly make sure we clearly, you know, state that in the future, that these are elements that you'll get out of this process. Working with Charles R. Drew University, one of the initial ideas was shutting down a whole street and making a promenade. And just that kernel, you know, is what really drove, you know, that whole client, that whole project to that next level. And even also thinking about, you know, sustainability and bringing it, you know, to the forefront, that it's no longer just this scary element that is expensive that happens later in the project, but thinking about it not as sustainability, but thinking about it as wellness. You know, thinking about all of these elements and putting, you know, a little different spin on it, and that being the disruption. You know, it doesn't have to be gigantic earth shifting, but it's, our practice has been able to bring these small adjustments, which has really carried us forward. So making sure we don't lose sight of that. And then also just be, like I said, back to your question, Joe, being stronger about what we can provide, what we will be providing, and how that narrative is framed.